privilege to welcome you to this exciting event featuring our illustrious alumni. Christine already told you that I'm in the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, serving as Associate Dean. With 22 departments, 4 area studies programs, 5 research centers, 3 scholars programs for undergraduates, and 21 graduate programs, our college spans the disciplines, the centuries, and the globe. Our college's mission is to help our students develop skills and knowledge to prepare them for a variety of careers and a lifetime of thoughtful citizenship and leadership in a complex world. The 3 panelists today are evidence of our job well done. So Dr. Merner, Dr. Gibbons, and Dr. Gay, we are so proud to claim you as our alumni of 3 different doctoral programs in our college. Welcome back to UMBC. Know that 90,000 UMBC alumni, of that 90,000, 54% are from our college. And 4 of the top 5 highly enrolled departments in our college are in the social sciences. Therefore, we can expect several more illustrious social science alumni in the years to come. The Center for Social Science Scholarship that is hosting today's event is the most recently established of the 5 research centers in our college. All our research centers play a central role on this campus in advancing intellectual exchange, fostering interdisciplinary collaborations, and providing research support for scholars across our community. The Center for Social Science Scholarship was established in 2018 with a broad ambition to promote excellence in and to amplify the social sciences at UMBC. Each year, the center reaches several thousand faculty, staff, and students and community members through a series of initiatives that provide a space for academic debates, academic and public debates on issues that are of relevance to the social sciences. Examples of these initiatives include a distinguished lecture series, focused working groups led by faculty and graduate students on a variety of social science research topics, and most recently a podcast series titled Retrieving the Social Sciences that launched in 2021. With 46 episodes and counting, the podcast series aims to bring the best of the social sciences to you. So be sure to browse this on the center's website, socialscience.umbc.edu. Now, without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Dr. Felipe Filomeno. Dr. Filomeno is Associate Director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship and Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Global Studies program. His interdisciplinary, community-based scholarship is focused on human development in Latin America and in the Latin American diaspora in the United States. So, with that I will ask.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacob. When we created this event a few years ago, we had the first version only online. This is the first time we have it in person. The idea that originated that was my effort to convince our undergraduate students that the research skills that they get at UMBC can give them great jobs, and outside of academia as well. So regardless of whether you're going to grad school or not, even if you don't want to be a professor, those research skills are very important and highly transferable to careers outside of academia. And we have here 3 alums that illustrate that very well, so it's my pleasure to give you the introductions. In order here, Delta Merner, she earned a PhD in Geography and Environmental Systems from UMBC. Dr. Merner is the lead scientist for the Science Hub for Climate Litigation at the Union of Concerned Scientists, UCS. Prior to joining UCS, she was a senior scientist at the American Institute of Physics. She has been quoted in ABC News, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Financial Times, The Lancet, and NPR. and has written for The Hill and Scientific American. Her research has been published in Nature Climate Change, the Bulletin of the American Mathematical Society, and AGU Earth's Future. Brent Gibbons earned a PhD in public policy from UMBC with a concentration in health policy. He is a research public health analyst in RTI International's Health Economics program. With more than 15 years of research experience, Dr. Gibbons provides expertise in behavioral health policy analysis, health economics, and health services research. He currently works with government agencies and foundations in the United States, and before that he served as director of the Center for Health Services and Policy Research of the National University of Singapore. Then, Brittany earned a PhD in Applied Developmental Psychology with a concentration in Educational Context of Development from UMBC. Dr. Gay is the Associate Director of Implementation Science within the Research Translation Platform at Penn State's Evidence to Impact Collaborative. She is also the Lead Policy Associate with the Research to Policy Collaboration. Please join me in welcoming them. I'll ask them a series of questions. Everyone will answer the same question. We'll start from here to there and then go from there to here. But I'll make sure to give you time for Q&A at the end, and we'll also be mingling, taking advantage of the refreshments over there. So my first question is, please describe the organization you work for and your role in the organization.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for being here. As you said, my name is Dr. Delta Merner. I work at the Union of Concerned Scientists, which I will call UCS. And UCS is a nonprofit, so we're a US-based nonprofit. And we do work to put science into action to build a healthier, safer, and more equitable society. So our organization was started back in 1969 by a number of grad students and professors at MIT who were concerned with how science was influencing the war in Vietnam. This was kind of the peak of the war, and there was a lot of concern with government money going to fund science and military instead of looking at how science could be funded for environmental and social justice. So that was kind of the roots of the organization. It's grown in a lot of ways now. So we now have, I think, a little over 500,000 members that are part of UCS, and any scientist can be a part of it. We also have supporters. And we have about 25,000 scientists who are engaged. So we have a network of scientists that we help to get them more involved in how their science can influence action through policy, through litigation, through other kind of how decisions are being made in society. We have a couple of different departments, so there's science and democracy. We have a group that works on nuclear weapons. We have a food and agriculture department. We have energy, and we have climate. And I personally work in the climate area of UCS. So UCS started with climates really focusing on climate impacts, which makes a lot of sense. And then about 6 years ago, they realized that climate policy wasn't moving forward, and a lot of that had to do with corporate influence that was preventing climate action from really happening. So they started a climate accountability group, and my job is nested within that climate accountability group. So I work with a handful of other scientists, but we also have organizers, we have communications folks, as well as expert matter individuals. I specifically run what is called the Science Hub for Climate Litigation, and I'm the lead scientist there. And we do work to inform climate litigation. So seeing climate litigation as one tool in the toolbox for climate accountability, and understanding that now social decisions are being made in the courts, and that's something in the latest IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, their report mentioned that climate litigation is starting to shape climate governance. And we want to make sure that those decisions are being shaped by robust and meaningful science. So that is a piece of it, and we'll talk a lot more about what that actually looks like in the science that I do within that.
It's great to be here. So I graduated in 2013 with, as Dr. Felipe said, a public policy degree, and I've worked in both private university, and now I'm in a nonprofit. And so I'll describe, my research and the nonprofit, but we'll also kind of describe my role. And so I ended up focusing on early behavioral health policy. It was an interest that I developed early on. There was a lot of need for research in that area, and there were mentors at the School of Public Policy. And so I've kind of continued throughout my career to focus on this area, so mental health and substance use policy and services research. And the group that I now work at has a really strong department in behavioral health policy. And so that's what led me to work at RTI, the Research Triangle Institute, or RTI International. And it's a very large nonprofit. It was founded in 1959. So it was, I think, the first company in the Research Triangle area, which includes lots of other research organizations there, and it's kind of the Duke and NC State and UNC area, that triangle. But researchers for RTI are all over the world. It's an international organization. It has about 6,000 staff, and this is across over 250 disciplines. So the research agenda of the nonprofit as a whole covers a wide array of focus areas, and they produce basic science all the way to like policy and practice research, implementation science, and so really the whole continuum. And so my role, I'm in the health practice area. It's the largest group at RTI. There's a lot of federal money for health research, and so we work in contracts, so federal contracts. Most of my work is with domestic research, but we also have grants and foundation work. So I work with the Pew Charitable Trust that I'm directing a research project on. We have 2 NIH grants looking at the opioid and overdose crisis, and work with the CDC. So there's really a lot of flexibility being at a nonprofit institution that it solely focuses on research. I think one of the benefits of being at a group like RTI is it's looked at as an independent, kind of nonpartisan research institute, and so it can provide research to really inform policy and practice from that nonpartisan lens. And so my role at RTI, I'm a research leader. I'm in the health economics program, but I'm a little bit of an outsider in my program because I do I have more of a focus on policy and health services research, but often using economics tools. But what you'll find in outfits like RTI or NORC or Mathematica, these different research institutes, they're really multidisciplinary. So that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed is we'll have multidisciplinary teams, including economists, implementation scientists, epidemiologists, working together to solve problems. I'm also involved in getting funding, so that's part of the work as well, working on proposals and looking for requests for research. And finally, I'm involved in mentoring junior staff. So I'll end there, but I'm excited to talk more about my work. Thank you.
Awesome. I feel, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Kind of interesting going after these 2 very experienced people. So I am an early career scholar. I graduated just a couple years ago with my PhD, so hopefully this will give you a different side of what you can do with research and PhDs, if that's what you're interested in. So I have dual roles, as Dr. Felipe had mentioned. I'll start with talking through my first role, which is the Associate Director of Implementation Science with the Evidence to Impact Collaborative at Penn State University, which is a mouthful. So with the Research Translation Platform, we have a bunch of different initiatives that at the end of the day, our goal is to increase policymakers' use of research evidence in the work that they're doing, whether that's constituent outreach or writing legislation or just kind of getting the word out. We aim to make their decisions a little more informed, or at least providing the information if they choose to use it. So within the research translation platform, we have initiatives such as Results First, which we recently acquired from PUBL, Family Impact Seminars, recently acquired from Purdue, and also the Research to Policy collaboration. So as the Associate Director of Implementation Science, I provide insights on how we implement several of those programs, figuring out where is our capacity, where do we need to bolster it, what best practices can we incorporate and bolster to improve the impact of the work that we're doing for those initiatives. My other role is the lead policy associate within the Research to Policy collaboration. And there I lead a team of policy associates in helping to bridge the research and policy making communities. So right now we're working a lot with federal Congress, doing needs assessments with policymakers to identify their evidence needs. And then we go and we work with a group of researchers to help bolster their capacity to understand the policymaking process and meet policymakers where they're at without lobbying, which means it's a lot of education for both policymakers and researchers. So it's a lot of boots on the ground, capacity building, providing technical assistance to both groups, and just kind of liaising between the two. So it's a lot of leveraging research skills in a very practical way.
Wonderful, thank you all. Research usually starts with identifying a problem that needs to be solved, a question that needs to be answered. So I'm curious about the problems and questions that you address in your work. And we'll start with
Yeah, so the biggest question that our work addresses is how can we make evidence useful instead of just being kind of academics reading things from other academics. So we really want to kind of shorten the gap between, I think like it's in the literature somewhere, it takes like 10 years or so for evidence to actually get to policymakers and into legislation. So understanding best practices to support policymakers' use of evidence and also support researchers' engagement in that. So it's a mix of like community mobilization and just education.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, my focus area is behavioral health. Largely, I'm looking at behavioral health systems, so the treatments, the services, the insurance that also have policies underlying them. So what policies are underlying the behavioral health systems that help address the needs in communities and individuals. And so this is, mental health and substance use, and we do have a lot of those needs for sure. Some of the questions, I'll give you some examples that we're currently tackling. One is this new number called 988. So it's akin to 911, but for behavioral health crises. And there's systems that are being developed around those numbers. So you not only have a hotline, but you have basically like mobile crisis that can come to individuals who are in need, as well as stabilization units, so places where people can go outside of the hospital. But there's not a lot of evidence to support how these systems should work. And so suddenly the legislation for 988 led to a great need for research in this area, and we've already published a paper that looks at a current system model in Arizona and whether or not evidence supports that system. I'm also working a lot in the opioid and overdose epidemic. Specifically, there are 2 NIH grants that are large project interventions, so they're under what's called the Helping End Addiction Long-Term Initiative at NIDA, and this has funded a huge array of research from kind of treatments to address OUD, opioid use disorder, to how to address pain. There's really just a wide array of research that's been funded. But we're looking at, in one project, Heal Prevention, basically programs that can help prevent misuse of opioids in the beginning, so at the start of the continuum, as well as a project that looks at community level interventions where you take data and use evidence-based practices from that data that informs what programs to put in place. I've also looked in my career at parity, the legislation that requires that behavioral health is covered at the same levels as medical and surgical. And so recently, I looked at in Medicare policy, there was a change to cover behavioral health at the same levels, and whether that led to increased access and essentially better outcomes. And finally, like we generally, in the health economics program, we often support evaluations and questions around essentially effectiveness and cost effectiveness of new programs that are being developed. So as an example, there was a project where we looked at screening programs in ED and emergency departments and whether or not they were cost effective. It's very costly to do anything in the ED, and so there was a high bar for it being cost effective, but we found that it was. So I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, great. So yeah, my training at UMBC was also interdisciplinary, which we've talked about a little bit, but today I'll focus kind of on the social science piece of it. One thing that I do think is important is my training, being literate in both physical science and social science has been a huge asset to the work that I do. And I often am working on multidisciplinary teams, so there's a few projects that are purely social science, but some of them are, and I'll talk about just a few of the projects that I've been working on over the last year. So similarly to what Dr. Gay was saying, there's a lot of work that happens so that science can more easily be communicated to policy and so that it can effectively form policy. And the work that I do, as I mentioned earlier, is really how research can inform litigation. And again, this is understanding that litigation is a space where important decisions are being made that are impacting our lives, and we want to make sure that science is being communicated well in those spaces. So that's just to give you kind of the overview of where this research sits. So for the work that I do, we're really looking at accountability for climate change. In the social science space, I've done a lot of work around kind of power and knowledge of the major fossil fuel companies. So understanding when they knew about climate change and how they responded. So looking kind of back into archival records and other pieces, kind of understanding what really happened and how that then often relates to when we understood what was happening with the physical science at the same time. But there's a pure kind of social science aspect to that. We also ask a lot of questions about what the impacts of climate change are and how people are impacted by that, and there's inherently social science questions that are a huge component of understanding any climate impacts. We do a lot on, more recently, trying to think about how to think about and how to measure compound risk through different risk analysis and different risk measures. Again, incredibly interdisciplinary. We're really relying on the social science for a lot of those pieces. I also do a lot of work on kind of what is happening with litigation itself. So I've done research that looks at, that's comparative analysis of litigation across different countries to say how it's actually impacting policy, if it's actually impacting policy, if it's impacting decisions at all. So we have a paper that's coming out on that, and sometimes it's on specific components. So we've got a research paper that looks at net zero, so kind of one specific area within climate change, within litigation, and how that compares across countries and across different kind of techniques or tactics within litigation. And then finally, a big chunk of the work that I do is to study kind of what else needs to be studied. So last year we did interviews with litigators and legal scholars to talk about what science they need to inform their work, what they use, what they wish they use, better understanding maybe what they're having a hard time understanding, and then helping to translate that to the scientific community as well. So we did a policy brief that really outlined all those findings, but we also published a paper that kind of set a research agenda for what engagement looks like in this space, and that includes for physical scientists and social scientists as well.
Great. If you go to the UMBC research website, you will see research, public research for public good, and you can hear this resonate across all their statements here. So it's great to see this on-the-ground illustration of how that looks like. After we identify a research problem, a question, we need to collect and analyze data to find an answer or a solution. And I'm curious, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so that looks really different depending on the research question, but there's a lot of rich areas for data. So as I said in the beginning, I do a lot of archival and document research, and it's kind of going back on corporate documents, the archives, what's there. Sometimes it's going through previous litigation and seeing disclosure, getting documents that way, understanding the pieces and doing the research that way. For some of the vulnerability and risk analysis work that we do, it's much more economic and demographic information that gets used for that. Sometimes we're combining that with the modeling that we're doing. For the comparative analysis, that is research that happens just from those documents. So that's document analysis, or looking at kind of either briefs and submissions of litigation or the court findings, depending where we are in the cases, and doing direct comparisons of that. And then finally, for the last piece that I talked about, kind of understanding what research needs to happen, that's interviews. So I conducted interviews, and this year hopefully we'll be adding surveys to that as well, so that we can do both surveys and interviews to get a larger group, especially as this field grows. So 4 years ago when I started working in climate litigation, there were a handful of cases that we were really interested in. In the last year alone, there's been 190 additional cases that have been filed across the globe. So it's growing pretty rapidly. There's now over 2,000 cases, really around 100 that we work on in some meaningful way. So it's growing rapidly. So interviews get harder as those numbers increase.
So as Delta mentioned, I mean, there's a range of data sources, and it really depends on the study and what data sources will best address the research questions. But it also depends on the amount of funding and the time that you have to do the work. So in some cases, we work for the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, and they often want things done very quickly. They actually report some of their findings to the White House, and so it really depends on the needs and priorities of the clients that you're working for, and sometimes those can change quite quickly. So as an example of just the kind of data that we use and analyses that we use on those data, I mentioned the parity analysis with Medicare, so we use Medicare claims data. So that was, that's already collected data for an administrative purpose, and then you're using it as secondary data, for a study and analyzing that data. And we really were looking at whether or not, when we expected a change to occur in use of services, actually happened for behavioral health services because of parity. In the recent analysis I talked about with crisis systems, we looked at this state, Arizona versus Nevada, and we used AHRQ data, HCUP data. It's basically hospital and ED data across all states. Depending on, for some states, availability isn't always there, but we looked at basically a difference in difference approach, trying to ascertain, was there an effect, rather than just an association. We also, as Delta mentioned, we do a lot of qualitative as well, so I've really been trained more in quantitative methods, but have been finding that I need to get more skilled in qualitative methods. We do a lot of interviews with subject matter experts, policymakers, and so I'm learning some of those skills, and it's nice to have that chance to kind of broaden my skill set. Generally, in my group, we're using economics tools. So we're using econometrics, we're using economic evaluation, like cost effectiveness analysis. But more commonly in evaluation, there's mixed methods that's being used. So you're actually integrating the qualitative and the quantitative together. But generally in my work, I'm often thinking about causal inference. So trying to attribute cause to a policy or a program's effect. So I'll stop there.
I think that's a really good segue. I am a mixed methodologist, so I was trained in both qualitative and quantitative, though I do have a bias towards the qualitative aspects. So it's a nice flip side of that. I'll focus primarily on the types of data that we get through implementation of the research to policy collaboration. which involves survey, quantitative and observational data, and also some qualitative as well. But we use them all differently because you should always choose the method that best aligns with what it is that you're trying to answer, as everyone else has emphasized. So being on the implementation side, I'm usually involved in data collection and also helping the analytics team interpret the data, providing some insights about like, well, here's my perception of how things are or what this means in this context, because I'm the person who works with the people the most that we're collecting data from. I just omit myself from the analysis part just to reduce any bias that could be introduced into analyzing those data. So being trained in qualitative, I'm the one usually talking to policymakers. I met with someone in Congress yesterday, talking to them about like, what evidence do you not have access to, what evidence do you need, what do you not understand about what you are getting, and what do you not like about it, things like that. But I also do focus groups with the researchers that we talk to, seeing how we might be able to better suit their needs in terms of policy engagement. Because we're really trying to meet everyone where they're at, which is really hard when you're working with a lot of different people. So periodically checking in with them and seeing like, well, what are your needs and how are the strategies that we're using addressing what it is that you need, so that we can work to optimize and adapt the implementation of the model that we're doing. We are also doing an impact analysis of the research to policy collaboration model. It's something that we've done in the past that was published in PNAS and then also American Psychologist. So if y'all are interested, you're more than welcome. I can pass those links along. But basically it's a dual model behavior change model where we're trying to get researchers more engaged, we're trying to get policymakers more engaged. And that involves some survey collection, and then, yeah, I guess a little bit of everything.
Great, so for everyone here taking a research methods class or writing a capstone research paper for global studies, this is the purpose, right, for you to be able to do this kind of work eventually. So you collected the data, analyzed the data, arrived at some findings. What do you do with them, right? They are not supposed to just stay in your desk, right? So what happens?
Yeah, so with the randomized controlled trial that we're doing, that'll eventually, because of the time that it takes, it's usually just going to be published and explained to other academics and conferences and whatnot. To understand some of the best practices that I've been discussing, we do different rapid cycle learning tests, where we test different messages that are based in theory and see which message best performs for the outcome that we're hoping for. And then we use the results from that to optimize the implementation of the model. So we take those results pretty immediately and use them to incorporate into a subgroup of our population gets the optimized version of what we're implementing. So that's really quick, and it involves a lot of collaboration between analytics, evaluation, and implementation, lots of team meetings. And then also the data that we receive from the rapid cycle learning and also the focus groups and just things that we hear from folks throughout implementation, we use to help inform whether we're implementing with equity in mind. Equitable implementation is something that's been rightfully so more of a priority in the past few years. So we can see like who isn't engaging is just as important as who is engaging, and thinking if there's any correlates between specific strategies that we're doing and if we might be able to modify those, if it could be disengaging or hindering someone's involvement.
For us, I mean, I think generally this is a big challenge, and we're all kind of, it seems like, working in a space where we're trying to influence policy or, affect change, possibly through litigation, but in some manner really affect the laws or practices. And I think, often as researchers, we don't always have those tools. And so, we look for manuscripts, when we start academic research, but really, policymakers, decision makers aren't going to be reading those. And so we try to supplement any reports with blogs or obviously presentations, but if there's any media pickup, that's always great to kind of get the word out there. But really, we want to get research in the hands or in the eyes of these decision makers, practitioners, policymakers. And so, to do that, sometimes it's immediately clear how we can because we're working for a client like a state or the federal government where we have direct access, and so we're producing research for them, and so we're presenting back the findings to them. In other cases, I've actually done work where it's the work has gone into a report to Congress. And this was a study that looked at paying alternatives in Medicare to opioids, and so in some cases, you can actually have your reports get seen by legislators. I haven't heard of anything that's come out of that, so I'm kind of waiting to see what will happen. But I think in kind of gauging this audience, you want to be really brief and clear with the evidence that you're showing, and include different kinds of evidence. So I think they're looking for how will this impact the population that I'm serving? How will this impact, or what will this cost? What will this do for my budget? So how will this impact my budget? And then how can I implement this well? So these are all the kinds of things that we're thinking of getting in front of decision makers and policymakers.
Yeah, so I feel like at UCS I'm really lucky because the organization works in a way such that we have about a third of our organization is scientists, a third are campaigners, and a third are communication experts. And for me, in order to get science out there, you need to do more than just publish it in a journal, right? It can just sit in the journal, and then you need those other experts to be thinking about how the research can move. So as we're doing research, which it's critical that we're doing independent and rigorous research, and even in our funding structures, we don't take any corporate money, we don't have government grant money. We do a lot to make sure that we're ensuring independence in the work that we're doing, and rigor. So one of the top goals is always to have it published, and the work that I've worked on, we've always had journal articles so that we're going through that peer review process, and you have kind of those aspects to it. But we also think about all the other products and outcomes from that work, and we think about that from the beginning. So, as was mentioned, when we have journal articles, we tend to also write reports that are more accessible, and we think about who needs to be reading those reports, what that might look like, and how we can tailor that language for them, how we can have graphs that are accessible, how we can explain the methodologies in meaningful ways that, that reach those audiences. We'll do, depending on the pieces, sometimes you have to think about different geographic breakdowns. So maybe what we published was for a whole region because that's what we wanted to do for the journal article, but then we'll take kind of a state breakdown or a different regional breakdown or an ecosystem breakdown of that same data and have that in reports for constituencies who can look at that. So whether that's state policy briefs or it's a national park that kind of goes over borders and it's more useful to understand it in different boundaries, right? So thinking about how you actually implement it, who's implementing kind of outcomes from that, and how you need the results to be broken down for that to be meaningful. It's important that we get it in front of the decision makers, which folks have already talked about. So there's that piece, and you have to have that network of decision makers and be building that constantly so that you know what they're looking for, you can give them the information as they need it, and you're there and available for them to ask questions to, which is a huge part of it. There's also the social media and the traditional media piece of it, which I wasn't expecting kind of coming into this work, how much media work I would do, and I feel like I spend maybe 10% of my time talking to media, which was something that I was not prepared for and didn't ever expect, but that's, I think, a really key part of science communication. And I think what a lot of this boils down to is communicating science and communicating science to different audiences in meaningful ways. So I feel lucky that, I guess, because we've got a team that's working on different pieces, we can take opportunities when they come up, when they are presented to us, to be able to communicate our science in different venues. So last week I spoke to about 100 Brazilian judges and just talked to them about scientific findings from a couple of reports that we had, a little bit of a more scope for the region that they were looking at, and just answered questions for them so that they had a scientist in front of them that they could ask questions to. Sometimes it's about getting it into briefs, like was already talked about, in policy briefs, into litigation pieces, and then it's a lot of podcasts and blogs and other kind of communication pieces. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. I have a couple more questions, but I want to make sure that the audience can participate. And since this event was designed with undergraduate students in mind, I want to make sure that they get preference asking their questions first. So, do we have any questions from students here in the room? Jolene.
So, from my impression of public discourse involving these kinds of issues, I haven't gotten much sense that politicians typically have much respect for scientific findings and evidence. What is your experience in this regard? Like, how do you convince them to take action and listen? Or are they like that behind closed doors as well? Or is the kind of defiance that you see in public a public front?
Would like to take that?
Whoever feels.
Yeah,
Because
I feel like I can take some of that on. So it definitely depends. So something that we think of in implementation is readiness. So are they ready to think about research in a way that enables them to actually engage in the model that we're presenting? But I'll also throw in a caveat that a lot of what you see on the news is escalated because they want to make the news. They want to be someone who shows up when you search for them. Most of the time, more often than not, I'm going to be meeting with actually staffers. So in federal Congress, at least, every office, every policymaker has a host of staffers that help them. It varies on how many staffers they have across the House and the Senate, across like what their position is, how much leadership they have. But portfolios will be divided between several staff members. So one staff member might be in charge of education, and you're going to want to talk to that staff member about research on education. If you go to their staffer on criminal justice, they're going to be like, it's not relevant to me, I don't care. Because they have so many other things that they have to focus on anyways. So it's in part about making sure you're bringing the evidence to the right person, and then also framing it in a way that doesn't turn them off from the research right out the gate. So I know like school choice is highly contested, but there's different ways of like packaging that information instead of saying like, oh, well, I feel this way about school choice or something. It's more about like presenting the evidence in ways that are true because evidence is what the evidence is, but using language and framing it in a way that will make them potentially more receptive to it.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. I don't do a lot on the Hill. My organization does more work than I do on the Hill. And when we go, we're not lobbying for issues, we're presenting science. And if the science is presented, again, kind of in spatial and geographic ways that are beneficial, that help them to better understand how to make decisions for their constituencies, I would say most of the time they want to hear it, whether or not they use it. Again, it's the staffers that you're trying to get a hold of. The staffers are really ultimately the ones who lift things up, and if it gets to a decision being made, it's because it went through them. So yeah, there's a lot of theatrics, and that's not how the kind of what it looks like underneath, I would say.
Yeah, I'll just add that there are, your legislators, and then there are your like program directors and your career staff implementing, like say CMS policy or state behavioral health policy, and so oftentimes we're working with the staff that are actually implementing the policy, and that's getting a more receptive ear to the evidence to inform their actions. But certainly, I hear you. I think that is definitely an issue, and there are certain areas that are just very difficult to pass legislation.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Hi. I'm glad to hear all of you and the fact that you have earned your PhD. Your training as a PhD, the language prepares you for a different audience. But now with your work environment and the years you've put in, how were you able to straddle that language, the way you communicate to the kind of audience what extra preparation went to that in getting to be able to communicate to that kind of audience that you are now, which is not typically, not essentially academic, and considering the years you went through in any of your PhD. So what training, extra training that went to that? I would be glad to hear that.
Yeah, I can start. So at my organization, they do media trainings, and on one of the first media training that I did, I was the only scientist who was on the team. We had there was campaigners and organizers who were there with me, and they showed a clip of some scientists speaking on CNN and kind of talking through this study that they had done, and they were like, all right, what did you all think of that? And I was like, oh, that was so great, it was so clear. And everyone else was like, we didn't understand anything. We have no idea what just happened. And I was like, oh, like, not only do you hear it differently, right, which I didn't even understand that I was hearing it differently. I thought that, like, it was very clear for a general audience. And you have to completely relearn those things, and you have to completely rethink about how you're presenting the research that you're talking about. I feel lucky because even in my research, so in the work that I did here, I was working with community kind of throughout the process. So I feel like I was always having to speak about my research to different audiences. I did community-based participatory research as part of my methodology. And then on my committee, I had 6 people on my committee. Half of them were physical scientists and half of them were social scientists. So even in the academic space, I felt like I was translating science kind of in that. And that was incredibly beneficial for me. And I think the more that you can be interdisciplinary in your scientific training so that you can understand when other people don't understand you even in that space is incredibly beneficial. And then you just need to keep engaging with folks that are outside of your specific expertise and make sure that you're engaging with folks who are asking questions. And to me, that was the most important way to learn.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. So I might be slightly of an anomaly. So I'm actually a first-gen college student from rural Georgia. So it's actually kind of weird for me to actually speak like an academic. So doing some more of the lay writing and lay communication just feels more natural to me, just because of how I've been socialized and raised. So it's kind of like leveraging my background, really.
Yeah, I'll just add that building on Delta's point about, there aren't even easy ways sometimes for different disciplines to talk to each other. We're actually working on a lexicon paper between epidemiologists, implementation scientists, and economists to be able to essentially translate when they have similar concepts that they're talking about, but they mean different things, to know what each other is talking about. And so I think that point was really well made, that just working in multidisciplinary teams, having exposure to other disciplines is really helpful to be able to start that process of learning how to communicate effectively to individuals who are outside of your discipline, and ultimately, more of the public and policymakers. But I think one of the things that I want to point out, which is somewhat unrelated, is that I don't think you need to get a PhD to kind of be in a position where you're communicating in this way. I think a lot of it is learned on the job, and it's experiential. And I recommend even students who are getting their undergrad to consider work in this area, that you can build a lot of these skill sets early. And companies are interested in hiring undergrads who can build their skill sets. I think on the job is often the time that you learn the most. You can learn a lot in your PhD, but then you get on the job and you realize, wow, I have a whole lot left to learn. So.
Mayor?
So people always act like the social sciences and the physical sciences don't really intersect that much, or I wouldn't say that they don't get along, but that they don't really mesh. I was wondering, from your work, as somebody who has a primarily social sciences background, I kind of want to know how to integrate into jobs where you have to work like super multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, work with people of other academic backgrounds and professional backgrounds?
I think that's more.
So there's a lot of different ways, but I will say often I am the only person in the room who has any qualitative skills, and teams don't often recognize that they need qualitative skills until you show them the importance of that, and then the majority of our projects are led really with that qualitative analysis. And increasingly the research questions that are being asked for the physical scientists are really being understood and found by social scientists, right? Because we're engaging with communities and understanding what those needs are. So once you're in the room, I will say that there's a clear understanding, right? But your question is partially how do you get into that room? And unfortunately, I will say in my career kind of coming up to it, it's been having statistical analysis in those pieces that have gotten me in the room initially, and then I've been able to spread out. I do think that that's changing. So, you know, I graduated almost a decade ago now, and I think that in my experience that's shifting a lot. So we are hiring more pure social scientists. We also have a lot more people who are mixed methods. That's increasingly common, and I will say that that's a huge asset in the workplace. But if you are purely social, it's really, as you're doing those interviews, making sure you're helping to understand how you add to those teams.
Our panel time is up, but if anyone here wants to ask questions directly to them as we take advantage of the refreshments, you're welcome to do so. For now, let's give them a round of applause.